This video is a response to the July 30th, 2018 publication that the U.S. Department of Fish and Game published regarding several species of Poecilotheria tarantulas restricting Americans from importing and exporting them from across state lines after July 30th of 2018, which in my opinion is damaging the populations that we have. I'm going to quote directly from their statement several different areas. There is also contact information on this publication to get more information, which I encourage you all to do. I'm going to read directly some targeted areas from the statement that I think will get the point across that these findings might be unsubstantiated and that making it illegal to take those animals across state lines may well be destroying the only chances that these animals have from ultimately meeting extinction. Let's get right into it. The first thing I want to discuss is the publication itself. I have highlighted several areas that I want to discuss. The executive summary begins discussing why they need to publish a rule under the Endangered Species Act of 1973, which was now an amended act. A species may be protected through listing as an endangered species or threatened species if it meets the following definition. And they talk about 5 things which they use. A, the present or threatened destruction, modification, or curtailment of its habitat or range. B, overutilization for commercial, recreational, scientific, or educational purposes. C, disease or predation. D, the inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. Or E, other natural or man-made factors affecting its continued existence. We have determined on the basis of the best available scientific and commercial data that P. fasciata, P. ornata, P. smithi, P. subfusca, and P. vittata are in danger of extinction because of 1. Ongoing habitat loss and degradation, and the cumulative effects of this and other threat factors. It also says that one species, P. smithi, is also in danger of extinction because of the effects of stochastic processes, and it goes into greater detail. Previous federal action. They state, we received a petition dated October 29th, 2010 from Wild Earth Guardians requesting that the following 11 tarantula species in the genus Poecilotheria be listed under the act as endangered or threatened. So the initial proposition was for these 11 species. Poecilotheria, fasciata, formosa, hanumavillosumica, metallica, miranda, ornata, petersoni, rufulata, smithi, striata, and subfusca. Okay, it goes on. After a 90-day finding, they presented that investigation of these 11 species was warranted. So it goes on, then they did a 12-month finding. They proposed a rule that they determined that the specific 5 species were in danger of extinction throughout their ranges and proposed listing them as endangered under the act. We requested input from the public, range country, and other interested parties and peer reviewers during a 60-day public comment period that ended February 13th of 2017. Now, one of the experts that responded to that was a mentor and role model of mine, someone that I greatly look up to, who shall remain unnamed. Actually was one of the people that replied to that. He advocated for the continued breeding of these animals in captivity, although his pleas were unheeded, and I'll talk to you guys about that once we get through this document. Now, this is pages and pages and pages of statistical data and lots of details, but as I said, I've tried to highlight some of the key points. Okay, they go on to specify that since then, Poecilotheria petersoni is now considered a junior synonym to the currently accepted name of P. vittata. So then they say from then on they'll refer to the 4 species and they include petersoni in with vittata. Now, here's something really interesting that I do not agree with at all. Most captive individuals of Poecilotheria species are in the pet trade. That is true. Few specimens of the species addressed in this rule are held in zoos. Also true. However, while rearing and keeping of captive individuals by hobbyists and vendors has provided information on life history of these species, we are not aware of any existing conservation programs for these species, including any in which specimens held or sold as pets contribute to the viability of these species within their native ranges in the wild. Individuals of these species that are held or sold as pets hold limited conservation value to the species in the wild because they are not genetically managed for conservation purposes. Individuals in the pet trade descend from wild individuals from unknown locations. They have undocumented lineages, come from limited stock, and are bred without knowledge or consideration of their genetics. They also likely include an unknown number of hybrids, which I make sure not to do, or unintentional crosses resulting from confusion and difficulty in species taxonomy and identification. So what they're saying is people in the private sector are not competent to breed these animals and keep the species pure, which I for one take very, very seriously. It talks about how further, many are likely several generations removed from wild ancestors and thus may be adversely affected by inbreeding or maladapted to conditions in the wild. In short, captive individuals held or sold as pets do not adhere to the IUCN guidelines for reintroduction and other conservation translocations. Further, we are not aware of any captive breeding programs for Poecilotheria that adheres to the IUCN guidelines. They go on to say, because the purpose of our status assessments is to determine the status of the species in the wild, we are not aware of any of the information indicating that captive individuals are contributing to the conservation of the species in the wild. That is true. At this time, captive species are not being reintroduced to the wild. However, if all of the wild populations are extinct and the only populations we have in captivity, their breeding is going to be paramount to keeping the species from going totally extinct. They say, we are not aware of any information indicating that captive individuals are contributing to the conservation of the species in the wild, and captive individuals held or sold as pets have limited value for conservation programs or for reintroduction purposes. We place little weight on the status of captive individuals in our assessment of the status of the 5 Poecilotheria species addressed in this rule. So they're not saying that they're unimportant. They almost are. What they're saying is that they are not affecting the wild populations, meaning that they're not helping. Okay, so they go on to talk about Poecilotheria biology and their microhabitats in the wild, macrohabitats, species-specific information. Each of the 5 species addressed in this finding is endemic to Sri Lanka and has a range restricted to a particular region and 1 or 2 of Sri Lanka's climate zones. So in the whole country, they're saying that these just come from 2 areas. Due to their secretive and nocturnal habits, sensitivity to vibrations, and their occurrence in structurally complex habitat, forest, Poecilotheria species are difficult to detect. Therefore, reported ranges are possibly smaller than the actual ranges of the species. They go on to say, however, this is the best information that they could ascertain. Historical ranges for the 5 species addressed in this rule are unknown. Further information on species abundance or population dynamics is not available on any of the 5 species. Therefore, population trends are unknown. What that tells me is they made this decision and they may not have had the information that they needed. However, based on the multitude of threats acting on these species, especially extensive and ongoing habitat loss and degradation, experts believe populations are declining and that these species are very likely to go extinct within the next 2 or 3 decades. I'm not saying they shouldn't be protected. What I'm saying is people in the private sector should be allowed to protect their numbers by breeding them freely in captivity. So they say, All 5 species are categorized on the National Red List of Sri Lanka as endangered or critically endangered based on their area of occupancy and distribution. They show some different maps highlighting the areas from which they originate. They talk about their biological niches. They go specifically into each species. Now getting to the summary of biological status and threats, specifically habitat loss and degradation. Habitat loss and degradation are considered primary factors negatively affecting Poecilotheria species. First, forest loss and degradation directly eliminate, reduce the availability of trees required for Poecilotheria species for reproduction, foraging, and protection. Second, due to the limited ability of Poecilotheria species to travel as well as their sedentary habits, forest loss and degradation are also likely to result in direct mortality of individuals or populations via physical trauma caused by the activities that result in forest loss and degradation, or the intentional killing of these spiders when they encounter human beings during these activities. Such mortality affects these species' abundances and distributions, and also their genetic diversity. So what they're saying is, as the forests are being torn down, as all these things occur, all those things together are grossly affecting the wild populations. In my opinion, if they're not being protected in the wild, we need to protect them in captivity. Due to habitat loss or any other factor, equates to a loss of unique genetic diversity. Well, didn't they just say that the captive populations are not genetically diverse, therefore unvaluable? And now they're stating that the wild populations are also not genetically diverse? Seems like a poor reason to discount the captive populations. Forest conservation measures. So of course I'm wondering, what are they doing to protect the forest so these animals and thousands others don't go extinct? Sri Lanka has taken steps in recent decades to conserve its forests, and these efforts have contributed to the slowing of deforestation in the country. In 1990, the country imposed a moratorium on logging in all natural forests. So they talk about how they mark certain areas and the steps that they're taking, which was really exciting to read. However, since the end of Sri Lanka's civil war in 2009, the government has been implementing an extensive 10-year development plan with a goal of transforming the country into a global economic and industrial hub. Does that sound like wildlife conservation to you? The plan includes large infrastructure projects throughout the country. Projects include, among other things, development of seaports, airports, expressways, railways, industrial parks, power plants, and water management systems that will allow for planned expansion of agriculture, and many of these projects have already started. There are different areas that talk about how some species of Poecilotheria have been documented living in these plantation and other agricultural areas, but then they go on to explain that really that appears to only be the case when those agricultural areas are butted up against the forest. So essentially, they're not staying exactly in their natural range because there are these plantations popping up in the middle of their forests. But the plantations that are away from the natural forests, they're not seeing these species, which indicates that they cannot live in the industrial or agriculture areas. For example, a new dam project within the range of Poecilotheria smithi will submerge one of the 2 sites at which the species is found. Well, they can't live underwater. The natural rate of loss of natural forest increased from 60 kilometers squared per year during 2000 to 2010 to 86 kilometers squared. A post-war reconstruction and development continues in Sri Lanka. So this is just last year that they're writing this report. Deforestation and forest degradation can be expected to rise. That does not bode well for these species. In summary, Sri Lanka has lost most of its forest cover due to a variety of factors over the past several decades. Very little wet zone in which the ranges of P. ornata, smithii, and subfusca occur remains in the country. The remainder is highly fragmented and continues to be deforested. Only about 35% of dense and open canopy, dry and intermediate zone forests, in which the range of P. fasciata and P. vittata, which includes Petersoni. Deforestation in these forests is ongoing, and recent rates of deforestation in the country have been highest in regions constituting large portions of the ranges of the two species. Forest cover continues to decline. Okay, now here's where it gets really good. Now pesticides. Pesticides are identified as a threat to Poecilotheria species in Sri Lanka. This finding could potentially be exposed to pesticides via pesticide drift into forests that are adjacent to crop growing areas. So now they're pointing out that all these agricultural areas that are near the forest could be poisoning the animals that are even living inside the forest. Over 100 pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and insecticide active ingredients are registered for use in Sri Lanka. It goes on to talk about all the neurotoxic insecticides and the negative effects on non-target organisms. Sit and wait predators tend to be more sensitive. The susceptibility of spiders to the direct effects of different pesticides varies with the type. It affects the species development stage, sex, abiotic and biotic conditions at the time. Then we get into climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, concluded that the warming of the climate system is unequivocal. Numerous long-term climate changes have been observed, including changes in land surface temperatures, precipitation patterns, ocean temperatures, and salinity. Various types of changes in climate can have direct or indirect effects on the species. They may be positive, neutral, or negative in that they may change over time. However, a large fraction of terrestrial and freshwater species face increased extinction risk under projected climate change during and beyond the current century, especially as climate change interacts with habitat modification and other factors. It goes on to specify Poecilotheria are ectotherms. Therefore, their body temperature varies with that of the environment. Their capacity to acclimate is generally low. Evidence also indicates they may have low potential to increase their resistance to desiccation, which is where they dry out. Meaning, as all these changes occur, they're very susceptible to death. Over the 6 to 10 decades prior to 2007, temperatures have increased within all climate zones of the country. Over the 6 to 10 decades prior to 2007, temperatures have increased within all climate zones of the country. The rate of warming has increased in more recent years. Trends in rainfall have been decreasing in Sri Lanka over the past several decades. Of course, I'm picking out key points here. While observed and projected changes in temperature and precipitation could potentially be within the tolerance limits of Poecilotheria species addressed in this finding, it is possible that climate change could directly negatively affect these species through rising land surface temperatures, changes in the amount and pattern of precipitation, and increases in the frequency and intensity of extreme climate events, such as heat waves or droughts. It is also possible that climate change could indirectly negatively affect these species by adversely impacting populations of their insect prey, which are also tropical ectotherms. The only detailed observation of a Sri Lankan Poecilotheria species indicated that P. fasciata found in the natural forest were emaciated and without spiderlings during an extended drought, while those found in an irrigated plantation had wider girths and spiderlings. The lack of reproduction in natural forests during the drought may have been due to desiccation stress or lack of availability of prey, or both, as a result of low moisture levels. So they talked about how the tarantulas on the plantations tend to be thriving more. But on the other hand, they also talked about the dangers of the animals of the plantations due to death by encounters with human, pesticides, and a range of other things. While at least one of the species addressed in this finding, P. fasciata, appears to be vulnerable to drought, the responses of the 5 Poecilotheria species to observed and projected climate change in Sri Lanka are largely unknown. However, the climate in Sri Lanka has already changed considerably. Therefore, while population-level responses of the 5 species addressed in this finding to be observed and projected changes in climate are not certain, the stress imposed on these species by increasing temperatures and changing patterns in precipitations is likely exacerbating the effects of the other factors acting on these species, such as stochastic events and habitat loss and degradation. None of the 5 species addressed in this rule are currently listed in the CITES Appendices, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, Wild Fauna and Flora, according to 2017, page 48. All 5 of the endemic Sri Lankan species addressed in this rule are bred by hobbyists and vendors and are available in the pet trade as captive bred individuals in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. We are not aware of any information on numbers of these species in domestic trade within the United States or numbers solely in foreign trade outside of the United States. So what they're saying is that they know and understand that we are keeping these animals in captivity, we are reproducing them, we are selling them, we are trading them. However, they don't have good information on those numbers. So what they're saying is these animals have been put on these protection lists. What that does, according to American government, it makes it illegal to take them across state lines. This greatly impedes people in the private hobby from reproducing them. I just had someone in California offer me a whole colony of Poecilotheria to reproduce. He says, I want to send them to you because you know how to breed them. And I've said, at this point, I don't know if that's legal. They were Metallica, so I've now discovered that Metallica are legal still to take across state lines. So that is excellent, and I will be contacting that hobbyist in California. So I will be doing that soon. All of that said, I want to mention a book by Dave and Tracy Barker. It's called The Invisible Ark in Defense of Captivity. Obviously, I'm not going to read this whole book to you. I'm just going to briefly explain the premise of this book. In the prologue, they talk about watching a program about a Chinese panda breeding compound, and they're talking about how in the wild they are going extinct. The reporter followed the whole expose with a question. Do you believe that if pandas become extinct in the wild, they should be kept in captivity? To this, the leading conservationist looked at the camera and replied, what would be the point? That comment struck them. They start to talk about something that they refer to as the mantra of the damned. Better extinct than only in captivity. And they talk about how wild that is, that a conservationist would actually value the life of the animal so little that they think that that animal is not worth keeping alive in captivity if their wild populations have gone extinct. How does that make any sense? As we begin to rebuild this planet, we could possibly one day repopulate the wild. We don't know, but why would you not want to try? They talk about a few different things. He talks about how the zoos across the world consider themselves the modern Noah's Ark, which is the preservation of the species. But he talks about how the zoos are not a part of the world's invisible ark. He says, the invisible ark is people, hundreds of millions of people around the globe who as individuals will work to keep species of plants and animals alive and safe in captivity. The invisible ark has many successes, and it already possesses a treasury of species of plants and animals maintained in viable captive populations. We are a proud part of it. Then at the end of the prologue, he says, if the rampant ongoing habitat destruction resulting from an exploding human population continues to endanger much of the vertebrate life on this planet, then starting today, if another python was not removed from the wild, if those species became extinct in the wild, there are 42 species and subspecies of pythons that have the potential to remain alive on Earth, shepherded into the future by their keepers. And he's referring to the populations of exotic animals that are being successfully reproduced in captivity. This is one of many great but unheralded conservation achievements. Notice, the US government does not consider private hobbyist conservationists. Dave and Tracy Barker do. Conservation achievements of the invisible ark. It has resulted from private keepers throughout the world investing hundreds of millions of dollars over a period of 30 years. This is a successful, decentralized, non-governmental, economically driven model of conservation that costs not 1 cent of the taxpayers' money. These pythons are safely in the care of the invisible ark, yet today, politicians, animal rights organizations, conservationists, and invasive species biologists are working hard to destroy this extraordinary accomplishment. Now, I read that directly. I quoted Dave and Tracy exactly because they're far more eloquent than I am. So I highly encourage you to support them, to buy this book, to read it. It's amazing. I have to say, I am devastated by this statement that was published by the American government, because you may know that I work very, very hard to reproduce all these beautiful species in captivity. I've reproduced a lot of Avicularia versicolor, more recently renamed Carabina versicolor. I'm wondering what's happening with those native populations since all those mad hurricanes last year. Has anyone gone to check on those wild populations? How are they doing in the wild? I can rest assured knowing at least that I've reproduced those animals that I have and that they are alive and well in captivity. I will continue to do so. I do not specifically reproduce the most beautiful, the most financially valuable animals. I reproduce all the species that I responsibly can. Why? Because I care and love for them, and I know that as humans, we have not done the best job maintaining our planet. I also am leaving a footprint behind. I'm not perfect. We as a human race, we're destroyers. But what we can do is, through our love of animals, is do our best to preserve the species. I highly encourage you all to contact the Fish and Wildlife Service. It says right here on the docket, it has the contact information. It says this final rule is available on the internet, and I'm going to list this so you can read and print the entire thing if you want. And it also says, for further information, contact Don Morgan, Chief Branch of Delisting and Foreign Species Ecological Services, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. And it has a phone number and it has a TDD. So for any of you who have more questions or who might want to question this, even though it states very clearly that they are lacking a lot of information, I highly encourage you to look more deeply into this. I beg that you all each individually do what you can to nurture the species. I do not personally believe that we should be taking as much as we do from wild populations, but that we should be plucking a few specimens when they are gravely needed, captive bred and captive born specimens in captivity, so we can preserve these species. I personally do believe that we still do need to collect out of the wild on a small scale. I don't think we can stop doing it, because I think that we do need those wild bloodlines and that we do need to continue to be interested in the wild populations. The headline of this video was the US government's choice to eradicate Poecilotheria, and I personally think that by finalizing this rule, they may be putting the nail in the coffin of these 5 species of Poecilotheria. I hope it doesn't happen. I hope that they can maintain their populations in the wild. I hope that Sri Lanka can save part of their forests and that Poecilotheria can thrive again one day. But I fear that that may not be the case. Even this report predicts that within 2 to 3 decades, those wild populations might be completely extinct. So what can we do? Learn about them, respect them. If you're up for the task, reproduce them. A lot of people think that we shouldn't be reproducing them, that that's irresponsible. Why not? If there's a market for them, if you have the knowledge, if you can do it, do. I have never been one to hide breeding secrets or how to care for an animal to keep it secret. I want us all to succeed. I want the planet to be a success. And as a final note, I want to read the response of my mentor, and he sent me the link to this article. I said, "Hello, he who shall remain unnamed. I was wondering if you had any information on what species of Poecilotheria were reclassified as endangered and if you knew what the laws were concerning these species in the United States. I know you live outside of the country, so I'm not sure if you know, but I'm hoping you can point me in the right direction. Thank you for your valuable time." He said, "Thank you for your query. Like you, I'm totally mystified by the asinine inclusion of the 5 Sri Lankan Poecilotheria species by the United States under the Endangered Species Act. When first proposed by the USFWS, the public could submit their for or against opinion for their consideration. Many informed research colleagues and I were opposed to this legislation and wrote alternative solutions for conservation of these species," and he sent me the link. "But it was to no avail. It fell on deaf ears. So I have no idea about the political reasoning to push the listing of these 5 Poecilotheria through the ESA or what this means now for the species that are being bred and sold in the pet trade. Attached is the final announcement, and I highlighted the contact information so you can further determine how this legislation affects Poecilotheria species being bred and sold in captivity. Good luck. Cheers." Obviously, I read all the information that he attached. I know this was long, and it might have been technical and boring to some of you, but this is very important information, and I did want to cite it specifically so no one thought that this was simply open to my interpretation. That was exactly what the report said. They state that their information is unclear. Do I believe these animals need to be protected? Absolutely. Do I think we need to be preserving the natural forest? Yes, I do. Do I understand that the humans and that the people of that nation also need a way to thrive? Yes, of course. There's no easy answer. But a simple solution would be to allow the people who were already breeding them in captivity to continue to do so. Is that going to be the answer to everything? No, obviously not. But it can help. And every little spiderling matters. I know this might have been a little bit dry. What do you think? Was it dry? Did I bore you? I hope that you guys found this interesting. I hope that this cleared up specific information that you have about the legislation here in America as far as what occurred this summer in the US. If you have any further information that pertains to this, I would love to hear about it or read any additional information. I hope that this helps. I hope that this sheds light, and I hope that it inspires you to keep on fighting as a small conservationist, such as I am, one exotic animal at a time. Together, as the big invisible arc, we each can make a difference. Hope you guys like this one. I'll see you soon.
The city lights, you're falling.